Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to try and start on time. My name is Brinda Sarathi. I'm director of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability, and I am a professor of environmental analysis. We are really, really thrilled to have you here today. It's Parents' Weekend. Welcome, parents. Welcome, trustees, and many other special guests at the college. And this talk is the Sullivan Lecture. We've held it for a number of years now, and it is in honor of Professor Jack Sullivan, whose passion for water was infectious. And I want to recognize Jackie Sullivan. His spouse is here today. And it is Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day to everyone in the audience. And this might be a little bit morbid, but I was thinking the title of this panel today is Forever Chemicals, so these will be with us forever, perhaps, the things we're going to talk about. So we're going to be looking at the issue of PFAS contamination in California's drinking water supply and beyond. In 2019, California state officials reported that chemicals widely used for decades in manufacturing and household products had seeped into the public's water supply. Known as forever chemicals, these substances are these common compounds have been detected in numerous water systems that serve up to 9 million Californians and are part of an unfolding public health crisis. And this is something that I'm learning about as we speak, and I feel we are so very honored to have a panel of eminent experts on this topic. And I've told my students, this is your chance to ask public officials as well as folks in the world of advocacy and in private industry what really can be done around this, because it's an unfolding issue. And so I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists. And the format today is they're going to try and stay on track, 15 to 20 minutes each to provide background information on this topic. And then, of course, the most important piece of today is engaging with you all. So please feel free to ask questions. And if for whatever reason something is not clear during the course of someone's presentation, we are open to you raising your hand if you just need a clarification, just so you're not confused while the rest of the panel takes place. So we'll start with Barbara Morrissey, who is a toxicologist with over 25 years of experience in environmental public health. She works at the Washington Department of Health, and she assesses potential health impacts of different environmental chemicals in food, water, and consumer products and our indoor environments. She is a science advisor, and I'm sorry, I'm reading this on my iPhone, and this is my mid-40s, so eyesight is problematic. She's a science advisor in policy development at the state and has worked on policy solutions for PFAS, flame retardants, and PCBs. And I'm going to skip the rest of this to say the reason I'm really excited about Barbara being here is her niece went to Pitzer College. And so when I met her, she said, wow, she had such a fantastic time at the college. And I said, well, how can we bring you down? And she just told me that when she was flying down today, she was on a plane with a number of Pitzer parents who said, what are you coming down here for? Are you on the program? So she is kind of a star guest. So thank you for coming down, Barbara. Followed by Barbara, who's public official, Department of Public Health. We have Andrea Ventura, who left a corporate career in publishing in 1995 to work with Clean Water Action's New Jersey chapter. And she later joined the Clean Water staff in California in 2003 and represents Clean Water Action as a member of Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. Andrea has a BA in history from UC Santa Barbara and did graduate work on immigration history at Utah State University. And I just love the different pathways into which a person with a liberal arts degree can move into these fields of environmental advocacy. After Andrea, we have Chair Joaquin Esquivel, who is appointed to be the chair of the California State Water Resource Control Board. So this is a special heads up to my Hustle and Flow students. We're lucky to have the chair with us today. He was appointed in 2017 by Governor Jerry Brown and was designated by Governor Gavin Newsom as chair in February of 2019. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary for Federal Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency in the Governor's Washington, D.C. office. He was born and raised in California's Coachella Valley, so Coachella IE represents, and he holds a BA from the University of California, Santa Barbara in English. And finally, we have Pete O'Connell with us. He is a principal engineer at Pall Water, and he has more than 20 years of experience on microfiltration and ultrafiltration, membrane processes, and system design for treatment of waters for potable use and wastewater reuse. And he has more than 39 years of experience in water treatment and other processes. He has written and presented papers for the American Water Works Association and also authored in a number of different journals. And he is kind of the, if we had to break it down, probably the Harvey Mudd representative amongst us. So I'm really excited to have such an esteemed panel, and we'll start in this order, and then at the end they'll all come up. Thank you, and help me welcome our speakers.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being invited to this today. I do work on PFAS quite a bit, but I also enjoy getting a chance to escape the Northwest weather in February. We are still wearing wool socks and scarves and our puffy coats up there. So this is, it's nice to be in the blinding sunlight today. So think about the last time that you filled a glass or a water bottle with water. And now, how many of you thought about contaminants in that water when you did that? Anybody? Few. Most of us probably didn't. And, you know, we have, by and large, the luxury of not thinking too much about pollutants in our water. We have a federal Safe Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, that regulates over 90 contaminants, 90 potential contaminants in community water systems. And in fact, tap water is better regulated than bottled water. There are, of course, limitations to that regulatory system, and we're going to be talking about one major example of that today, which are PFAS chemicals. Hang on here. Let me get to my... There we go. This is my title slide. So today I'm going to give an overview for about 10 minutes about what are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. We call them PFAS because it's a long name otherwise. And what's the issue with drinking water, and just kind of the basics. Like, where do they come from? How do we get exposed? And I'm going to leave what we're going to do about it to Pete. I'm also going to give you about 5 slides on what Washington State has been doing in the last few years to address the PFAS problems. And that's, so let's get to the first big question. What are PFAS? So PFAS include thousands of synthetic chemicals. It's a large class of chemicals. They've been used for decades to make many common stain-resistant, water-resistant, and non-stick consumer products. So these are pictures of some of them. So they repel water, so they're very good for, that is not showing up, outdoor gear like tents and waterproof jackets. They repel grease, so they're very good for stain-resistant coatings on carpets, and also like takeout food. You think of those coated containers, you know, with hot, greasy food inside. You don't want that to soak through, so those have most of those have PFAS in them. They're very stable in heat, so they've been used like for the lining for microwave popcorn, for instance. And are used in firefighting foams. Again, they're non-stick, so they've been used to make Teflon, very durable non-stick surface. They're also in some dental flosses. They're in parchment paper. They're in many, many different kinds of products. They're also used as surfactants, which are kind of like a soap-like material. So they're in cleaning products and some cosmetics and adhesives, and it goes on and on. Any chemistry majors out there? Okay. I'm always happy to have one. I will not go into the chemistry here, but just so you know, it's a very large class of compounds. They think that there's somewhere around 5,000 in the class. And again, there's kind of a variety of different, some are substances like durable Teflon, and some are single molecules. And what you need to understand is that even the polymers eventually will break down to form the non-polymer types. And I don't have my pointer is not working. Maybe it needs a new battery. I'll just walk over here. So the polymers in here are pretty durable. They're too big to be available to be absorbed in your body. They're not water soluble. They're not going to really go anywhere. They're going to go hopefully to the landfill and sit there for tens of thousands of years. But some of them have a kind of a molecule structure where these little pieces can break off. This is very common in paper and carpet. And those pieces that break off then are these pieces. And then these pieces can break down and become these pieces. And so this is the group that we've been measuring in water. These are the ones that we call forever chemicals, because once they get into those groups, no more breakdown. So it's important, the reason I'm showing you all this is that it's important if we're going to address PFAS, we have to address the direct releases of those perfluorinated compounds like from firefighting foam, but we also have to get at all the precursor chemicals and the substances that are eventually going to break down and generate those. And since we don't have a lot of chemistry people here, I'll go super quick on this. This is just the basic structure of the perfluoroalkyl acids, which are the ones in that far left column in the last slide. This is one of the more famous ones called PFAS. And you can see that it's just a long chain of carbons with fluorine. And that fluorine-carbon bond is super strong, and that's what makes them so resistant to environmental breakdown. They also have this tail of fluorines is hydrophobic, so doesn't like water. And the head is hydrophilic, does like water. And so that's what gives them their surfactant qualities. All right, so no, that's all the chemistry, I promise. Oh, wait, one last thing I want to say. This section at the end with all the fluorines, we sometimes call that the tail or the carbon chain. And different PFAS have different length chains. So you can have a chain of 4, a chain of 6, a chain of, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about long chain versus short chain in this slide, and I'm going to be brief. So the longer chain PFAS have been, for the most part, phased out of production between the years 2000 and 2015 in the US. They are still being made in other countries. And they have been largely replaced by PFAS chemistries with shorter chains. And the reason they've done that is the shorter chains are not as bioaccumulative as the longer chains. But the shorter chains are not without problems and not without concerns. So I just wanted to kind of talk about long chain versus short chain on this slide. So if you look at, for a long chain, again, highly persistent. Again, they got the nickname the forever chemicals. They're very highly bioaccumulative. So what does that mean? That means that if we're exposed to these in our food or drinking water or house dust, we're going to absorb them much faster than we're going to clear them from our body. In fact, it takes years to get rid of these from your blood. And so if you have it in your daily water, it's going to build up over time. The short chains are much less bioaccumulative, but I put question mark there because a lot of them haven't been tested. And so we're unsure exactly how bioaccumulative some of them are. Long chain, mobile in soil and in water, which means that they can leach from the surface if they're released like in a firefighting foam and get into the groundwater, and they can also move with the water underground. The short chain are even more mobile in soil and water, so we're concerned about them getting in groundwater if they're released. The longer chain have been found to be toxic in laboratory animals, and there's also supporting human data. Again, we've only got testing on several, and I'm going to get to that in my next slide. The shorter chain appeared to be less toxic from the data that we have, but again, there's only been a fair amount of testing on one. And so I have a question mark there about what we'll actually find when we have more complete tox packages on those. The shorter chain also appear to be more readily taken up into plants. So if they are in the soil or in the water that's irrigating a crop, they can actually be drawn up into the plant, including into the edible parts of the plant. And they're also, they've been a little bit tougher to filter out with the current technology, and Pete's going to talk a little bit about that. So health concerns. All right, so the toxicity and the health impacts of these compounds, still a very active area of research. We're still learning about the possible health impacts in people. Most of what we know is based on PFOA and PFAS, the two most famous members of this whole class, and like a handful of others. So in laboratory animals, we have a fair amount of data there. We see liver toxicity, that's probably the most sensitive endpoint, and then we also see developmental toxicity, reproductive toxicity, immune toxicity, hormone disruption, and increased occurrence of tumors in the liver, pancreas, testes, and some other tissues. So a lot of systems, a lot of organs impacted by these compounds. In humans, we have a few very large epidemiological studies. Those don't show a causal relationship necessarily, but they do support what we're seeing in the animals. We see increased cholesterol levels, increased serum liver enzymes, which are indication of liver damage. We see in especially children reduced immune response to vaccines, reduced growth and altered development, like altered timing for puberty. We've seen blood pressure problems during pregnancy, and thyroid disease, and a couple kinds of cancer. And again, these, sometimes we see them in one population and we study another population and we don't see them. So there's always a little bit of noise in the epidemiological data, and but we feel like we have enough to be concerned. So how are people exposed? Well, these are the three kind of main ways that we think people are exposed. If you have it in your drinking water, that can be a very significant source of exposure. It's also in a lot of food, contact paper, so it migrates into food that way, and also food, again, as I mentioned, that are grown in contaminated soils or irrigated with contaminated water. Can pick up some of that. And here I've showed some fast food, but it's also in meat and dairy and fish. And, sorry, it's kind of bad news. It's also, people can be exposed through other consumer products. So again, as I mentioned, at one point it was pretty much put on all carpets sold in the US from what we understand. And over time, those little pieces, as I showed in that one slide, break off and they get into the house dust. They can also be inhaled, and so we get exposures through carpets. Also, leather's treated that way. It's in ski wax, in snowboard wax. It's in all kinds of personal care products. We're always finding some new thing that it's in. So how do PFAS get from these consumer products into water? Well, in Washington state, every area that we know of where the groundwater is contaminated with PFAS is related to where firefighting foam was used. So here is a picture of a firefighter putting this foam, is a specialty foam that's used on flammable liquid fires. So oil and trains and cars and what have you. And that then can leach down through the soil because it's mobile and water soluble and get into usually the most shallow aquifer. It could also run off into nearby water. This is a picture of a bunch of foam that was used on a railroad track that got into the Columbia River before everybody knew how bad it was. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna just point out one thing here. Other pathways of exposure that are important are people that live near fluoropolymer plants or other industries where they're using these chemicals can breathe it in the air. It can also settle to the soil and go down into groundwater and contaminate groundwater around these plants. And then when the consumer products that have all these things go to the landfill, they come out of those products over time and get into the landfill leachate, which many cases gets taken to the wastewater treatment plant. And it doesn't get pulled out by the wastewater treatment plant. It doesn't get destroyed at the wastewater treatment plant. So it goes out into the water or it goes into the biosolids. So there's many ways that it can get into the environment. Once it gets into the environment, it's hard to intercept it in terms of stopping human exposures. But one point of intervention is drinking water. So if your drinking water supply is contaminated, you can treat it as it comes out of the ground and break that human exposure. So this is a slide that just shows the many sites across the country where we have found PFAS. This is an interactive source that's maintained by the Environmental Working Group and Northeastern University. And you can go to this website, and this is updated, I think, 4 times a year. So the dots here represent any detections. The purple dots are public drinking water or military sites. The blue dots are drinking water systems, and the red dots are industrial or other disposal sites. I mean, the point is, like, it's not a California problem. And I would say this map is heavily biased by how much testing has happened in different places. So we don't have a systematic testing effort that's gone on. Places that don't have any dots probably haven't looked. Michigan looks like it's just the hotbed for PFAS, but it's because they're out in front and they've done a lot of testing. So for PFAS, actually the states are leading the way in terms of addressing PFAS. And why is that? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, PFAS are not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA did establish in 2016 a lifetime health advisory for 2 PFAS, PFOA and PFAS. And that advisory level is 70 parts per trillion, which is a very low amount. It's much lower than many other water standards. And in terms of other federal action on PFAS, it's just been very, very limited. PFAS were grandfathered in under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was passed in 1976. What does that mean? That means that it was already out in commerce. It had been for decades. And so those chemicals didn't have to go through the review and approval process set up by TSCA. Instead, the onus was on the manufacturers to tell EPA if they thought there was a problem with their chemical. So that pretty much didn't happen until pretty recently. There have been voluntary phase-outs by the major manufacturers and stewardship agreements and some of these other things, but again, they're still not regulated under any of the major environmental laws, not the Clean Air Act, not the Clean Water Act, not Superfund, not RCRA, which is a waste act, and not required to be reported under the Toxics Release Inventory, although Congress just changed that, so that apparently is they will have to be reported. So we don't know who's using them. We don't know when they're being released. We really don't have the normal ways of getting a handle on a situation because they're not regulated in so many of these areas. EPA does have an action plan for these chemicals, and it's more of a plan than action. But they are doing a lot of toxicological studies right now. They do have a lot of scientists working on this, so I'm hopeful about that. We just haven't had a lot of actual regulation parts coming out. So, but it's in the plan, so we'll see. In terms of states being in the lead, a number of states are actually are in the process of establishing their own state drinking water regulations. This is pretty unusual. States don't do this. This takes a lot of time and resources, and they usually defer to the feds. But New Jersey has a state standard, a maximum contaminant level, which is sort of the enforceable standard for drinking water for 1 PFAS and 2 on the way. California had sort of a non-enforceable one, but because of a law that was just passed, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, in September, it sort of made it mandatory. So I wasn't sure if I should put them in under enforceable and non-enforceable, but there's some enforceable parts, so I stuck them on the top line. And then New Hampshire, Michigan, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Washington are all in process. And then a number of states have gone with the softer approach of like water guidance. It's not enforceable, but it does help people know when they need to take action to protect health. And then even more states have groundwater standards or screening levels, and they have gone kind of through this groundwater approach because it's a little bit easier. They can still kind of get at drinking water because they can find groundwater that's contaminated that's used for drinking water, and they can get that cleanup happening. Just different approaches. So a little bit about what we're doing in Washington. I like to think we've got some innovative things going on, so you see what you think after the talk. So here's a snapshot of where we are in Washington State with these chemicals in drinking water. We did do a survey in 2013-15, and about 140 community water systems, all the biggest ones, and then some of the medium ones tested. And those are the dark gray dots. So most of those were non-detect. The red dots, we had 3 of them, were detections. We're like, not too bad. However, there's 4,000 drinking water, large drinking water systems or regulated drinking water systems in Washington, and about 1% have been tested. So we still don't know about a lot of them. But then the military started testing around their bases. So they found it at Whidbey Island Naval Air Station in 2016, in private wells in one public water system, and then outside of Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane in 2017, very high levels in a public water system serving 7,000 people. And then Joint Base Lewis McChord, really 2 bases, one McChord Airfield and another was Army Base, found it in both of those areas around fire training areas. So we have a joint sort of Department of Ecology, Department of Health program in our state that develops statewide action plans to address persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals. So PFAS fit that bill. And these plans are developed in an open process with stakeholders and interested public. And we used this program to start studying PFAS in 2016. We expect to finish that plan this year. We had an interim plan out in 2018 just to prompt initial work that we knew needed to get going. And so the 4 main prongs of this plan is to ensure safe drinking water. So we need to test more public water systems, set action levels for more than those 2 PFAS, because we're finding way more than those 2 in our drinking water, and helping water systems respond when they do have detections. And then we need to manage environmental contamination, because we know we've got that. And we also have a lot of existing stockpiles of that firefighting foam that we don't want fire departments to use. There's a program at Department of Ecology that is contacting fire departments and helping them dispose of that safely so that it's not used. And And then we also have a piece, and this is where I think Washington's been kind of a leader, to just reduce the flow of PFAS into the state in products where there are safer substitutes. So I'm going to be talking about that in the next couple of slides. And finally, we still don't know. We still need to do a lot more study. Is it in our biosolids? Is it in areas where biosolids have been spread? What's happening at our landfills? So there's still a fair amount of study that we're going to do to figure out what else to do. So in terms of regulatory action, our Washington State legislature has been pretty active, and they didn't take action all by themselves. They had a lot of people that were interested and working hard to get these bills through. So there's 3 bills I want to talk about. 2018, we passed a ban on the entire class of PFAS in food contact paper, and that's contingent on finding safer alternatives. So our Department of Ecology is working on that piece right now. And then that same year, there was a ban on the entire class of PFAS in the firefighting foams. And the reason that they banned the entire class in both of those bills is they were concerned that manufacturers would just go with these shorter chain, and we were concerned that that was not going to solve the problem long term. And then last year, 2019, the legislature granted new authority to the Department of Ecology to take action on certain consumer products, to identify priority products and then determine and ban them basically through rule. And then lastly, my department is working with our State Board of Health to pass drinking water regulations. So just a couple words about each of those. The bill that reduced, that banned PFAS in food packaging was really trying to reduce PFAS in our food. And again, one of the drivers was that there was pretty wide detection in a couple of studies of PFAS in ingredients of these single-use food contact papers, like the little paper you use for 5 seconds to reach in and grab the bagel out, and the bakery papers, and the wrappings around hamburgers and sandwiches, French fry boxes and takeout boxes. They didn't find any in paper cups, by the way. So that was concerning to people because we felt like, one, there was also evidence that lots of manufacturers of those same products were not using PFAS, so we felt like there were probably good substitutes. And also, it just didn't seem like an essential use. Why do you need a forever chemical for a product that you're going to use for less than a couple of minutes? For the firefighting foam bill, this banned any training with the foams right away, so July 2018. And then it banned any intentionally added PFAS in foams sold or distributed in the state starting in July 2020, so that's coming right up. They did have some exemptions in there for uses that were required at the time to have PFAS. So there's a requirement called mil-spec that the military follows, and also the FAA, the Federal Aviation. And that actually was written at that time to require PFAS in that foam. So those have now been rewritten that they don't require it, but there still aren't any PFAS-free foams that meet that performance. So they're still working on that. I think there's some work in our legislature right now to remove those exemptions as soon as they find a suitable alternative. And then the last thing I want to talk about, second to the last, was our safer products for Washington. So this is this 5-year cycle that the legislature set up to be run through the agency, so we don't have to keep coming back to the legislature every session and asking for another action on another compound. They're like, we want you to do something broader when we have a whole class of compounds that we're concerned about. So this regulation basically identifies 5 priority classes of chemicals. So PFAS is one of them. And then it tells us to identify consumer products that are significant exposure to PFAS. that contained that chemistry, or that are a significant source of release out into the environment. So that's been done, and that's in a draft report right now. That goes to the legislature and sits there, and they can act on it if they don't like what we chose. And then phase 3, which will happen next year, is when we determine what regulatory actions we can take. And again, the legislature gets to weigh in and decide whether it likes what we did. And then phase 4 is actually doing restrictions, and that's through rule rather than through a law. The last thing I wanted to talk about was our drinking water regulation, because every state's doing this like a little bit differently. And so what happened in Washington is that the State Board of Health got a citizen petition from 9 organizations in 2017. I just want to mention that again because citizen groups have been really important in driving all of this action. It's not something that the agencies are just cooking up or the legislature is just cooking up. The citizen action is really, really important. So they petitioned this Board of Health. The Board of Health accepted that petition and initiated rulemaking. And the Department of Health supports the Board of Health, and so we draft the rule, and that's out now for public comment. And we anticipate that being completed by the end of this year. Couple of features of this draft rule is that we are proposing state action levels, which is kind of a bridge to an MCL, like an enforceable limit. So there's some things that are required. It requires all of the water systems that are regulated in Washington to test for PFAS. It requires them to notify their customers if they find it. It requires them to do follow-up monitoring if they find it. And it requires them to take action as directed by the department. And we're still having conversations about exactly what that will mean. So stay tuned. But in the meantime, part of my work over the last year was to come up with the recommended numbers for when action was indicated, and so I did that, and our numbers, just like many other states that are coming up with their own numbers, are quite a bit lower than EPA's numbers. So for PFOA and PFAS, I have 10 and 15 versus 70. And that's because there's new data out there, and there's new exposure models that involve children's exposures that we used. So I can answer more questions about that if people have questions. So that's my last slide. And thank you. You guys have been a good audience, and I look forward to your questions when we are a panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for having me here. Flew down from San Jose today. And I can tell you that San Jose has PFAS. We're probably not drinking it because we're a large enough city to have other sources. But it is a personal issue for us as well as a broader issue. So my name is Andrea Ventura. I am the Toxics Program Manager for Clean Water Action. We are an advocacy group. We were actually founded in 1972. We're national to write the Clean Water Act. So we've been around a long time, and I focus primarily on California issues. So what I was tasked to talk with, and I'm going to try to rush through some of my slides to be very honest with you, because this is a very much of a joint effort. PFAS is very complicated. It's kind of a multi-headed hydra, as you've seen from Barbara's presentation. A lot of things play into this, and I definitely want you to hear from our state board director, head of our state board, because a lot is going on. But my job today was to tell you really where the NGOs are coming in the state at PFAS, what direction we're coming in, what we're calling for, what we do know about PFAS in the state, as you just saw about Washington, what actions are taken in the state, and a little bit more about movement elsewhere, though you've seen some of that already. I want to reiterate something Barbara said. The action really is happening at the state level. We are part of a national coalition called Safer States, and these are all the states that are taking actions this year that we know of so far. I mean, it's only February. to address this, because we cannot rely on the federal government at this point. I don't think that's probably a surprise to many people, but fortunately our states are stepping up to the plate, and it is our communities that can help drive that or guide that or work with our state regulators. So, you know, we obviously all believe that we need strict health protections because of the dangers that these chemicals pose to human health. You heard a little bit about that. But because of that and the environmental impacts, this is a global problem. It's not, I'm talking about California, but this is truly a global problem. Basically, these things have spread, these chemicals have spread into all parts of the globe. They're being found in polar bears. They are being uptaken into our food sources and our drinking water. So that permanent nature and those environmental impacts require some strict health protections moving forward. So what are they? So I don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide. So it's a little hard to read from your angle anyway, but I just want to reiterate something very quickly that Barbara said. So if you hear nothing from me as an NGO, hear this. We totally agree. We have to look at these as a class of chemicals. I will tell you, in all honesty, 3M is in our state capitol this week. They are lobbying, trying, you know, they're hosting events to tell our legislators that short chain chemicals are safe, that we don't really have to worry about it. They have not been proven to be dangerous. But the science is not actually supporting that. It is moving towards showing that these chemicals are toxic. But regardless, because Barbara's right, we don't have all that data, and we never will for so many chemicals. The point is, who is the guinea pig for the industry? It certainly should not be the people of California or anywhere for that matter. However, looking at the class of chemicals is complex. It is not something you can just say, that's the way we're going to handle these, especially when you're looking at water. And I think Joaquin can speak to that a little better than I can because of some of the decisions they're making at the state board level. But California does have a number of advantages. One is the point that Barbara mentioned. All roads lead to those PFAS, those alkyl acids, because not only do shorter chained or more newer versions or the polymers break down into these PFAS, for which we do have health information, but they're also releasing PFAS when we're making those other forms. That's what happened if you saw the movie Dark Waters. That's what happened in West Virginia. The chemical that got into the water was actually from the manufacturer of other polymers. So that's why we feel that we need to address the class. The other thing I would say is that California is very rich in scientists that can really start innovating about, how do we look at chemicals? How do we look at groups of chemicals? If not the whole class, can we look at subsets of these chemicals? And can we make decisions about public health safety so that we can take appropriate action? So that is another thing that we do have an advantage about. But that was a mistake. But we have a long range of strategies that we have to take. So first of all, as I said, we need to look at these to the degree that is possible as a class. We also need to phase out all non-essential uses of PFAS. There was some discussion of that in the last presentation. It's kind of like, I call these chemicals the climate change of chemical problems, because they don't go away. Climate change isn't going to just go away. And we can't keep adding to the problem and think we're going to be able to treat our way out of it and survive that. We need to cut the head off the snake. We have to stop using these chemicals, and that also includes finding safer alternatives for essential uses. There is, for instance, a lot of innovation going on with the firefighting foam, and countries like Australia do not use them. Heathrow Airport does not use them. So there is innovation going there, and we need to do that. We do need to monitor for all PFAS in our water, for which we have validated methods. We need to clean up our drinking water, and that's a tough one, because the treatment for some is not the same for all, and Pete will speak to that a little bit later. But because of that, and because of the scope of the problem, we need to invest in low-cost innovations. We need to continue the research on what those treatment technologies need to be. We need to ensure that polluters pay their fair share of the costs, and this is something that is happening in various parts of the country. And we, like Washington is doing, they have this game plan for PFAS. We are calling for a multi-agency work group with stakeholder participation. You know, the water board can't do it all. Our toxics regulators can't do it all. The health department can't do it all. And the public needs to be invested and understand what this means too. So we are working toward that in the state. So where are we in the state? And I think that you kind of got a great line there when Barbara said, when you look for it, you're going to find it. So this map doesn't look quite as impressive as it really is as far as a problem, and I hate to be focused on a problem, but we're a very big state, right? But back in 2013, 2015, the federal government did monitoring around the country for 6 PFAS, and they looked for only 6. They looked at fairly high levels. Detection wasn't as sophisticated as it has gotten and continues to get. And they didn't look everywhere. They looked primarily at larger systems, a smattering of small systems around the country, and no private wells, which is a big issue in this state. And yet, in California, we had 28 public water systems that were impacted. That was 98 zip codes. In California, that means the potential impacts on 3.5 million people, okay? Now, what that testing did was highlight the problem. It made PFAS something that the public started to talk about. And you heard about West Virginia. If you Googled Minnesota or Michigan or Hoosick Falls, New York, or South Carolina, you got all these stories about PFAS, primarily PFOA and PFOS, but other chemicals as well. It was really shining a light on this problem, except in California. If you, in September of 2018, I Googled PFAS in California water, and I didn't find anything. Okay? It was not on the public's radar. It was not on our legislators' radar. And yet, as significant a problem as this limited data shows, we know that this isn't the end of the story. You saw that Michigan, part of the Michigan map in Barbara's presentation. That's because they started looking for more PFAS at lower levels in more systems. So extrapolating from that, if we start looking at the number of likely sources in the state for PFAS, our map would look more like that, and that is just wastewater treatment, military installations, and commercial airports. It does not include urban wildfire areas, it does not include landfills, and it doesn't include industry, like electroplating, which is a big deal here in Southern California. So we knew that the problem had to be bigger, and that's why in October of 2019 or 2018, 29 organizations signed on to a letter to our state water board saying, hey, we need to really get going on this. And what the letter particularly asked for was more monitoring for more PFAS at lower levels, and also to start thinking about how do we do this as a class. Maybe it wasn't going to be possible to do the whole group, but could we look at bigger chunks of this? But let's get that thought process going. Now, I have to say that we are very fortunate. You know, as an NGO, we're often pushing our state water board and other agencies to do more because we are working in the public interest. But we are very fortunate, and I'm saying this in all honesty, that it is my honor to be here with Joaquin because we do have a responsive state water board. And so I would say that from October of through 2019, we went from 0 to 80 in taking action. We have a lot of work to do, but they listen to this. So this is where we're at today, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. the first thing we did was set notification levels for the two big chemicals, PFOA and PFOS. We would have liked more at the time, but we didn't have data. Now, that is based first by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. These are our state scientists who help inform policy decisions. Policy has to take in economics and technical feasibility. 17, so we couldn't get down to these very low levels. But remember that the health advisory level for the national is 70 parts per trillion. We're saying it has to be a whole lot lower than that to protect public health. The notification levels could have been further because 14 out of 17 of our certified labs can get down to this levels on the far right, but we actually ended up with notification levels of 5.1 and 6.5 for the two chemicals. A notification level is for an unregulated contaminant, and it's when water systems are testing for those chemicals, and the state is trying to get a grip on what the problem is, they are supposed to, if they exceed that, they need to report that to the state. They are encouraged to report that to the public, and many do. But not all, that's not generally a requirement until recently. So that was a first step. A second step was that there was an informational hearing in March of 2020, excuse me. And no, we're in 2020, right? 2019. And I was fortunate enough and honored to be part of that hearing. But at that time, the Water Board launched a PFAS website that's quite good. And they launched a multi-year site investigation. This is two-pronged. They're going to be looking at potential sources like landfills, airports, refineries, et cetera. That will take many years, but they are also collecting data around water systems around those sites or water systems that were known to be contaminated. And we're getting that data in on a quarterly basis. This was the thing that is enforceable that happened also last year. AB 756 was introduced by Assemblymember Cristina Garcia, who represents part of LA County. It did do some administrative fixes to help the Water Board get out monitoring orders faster. But most importantly, it expanded public notification about PFAS because in the case of a notification level, it requires the public to be told that PFAS have been detected in their water. It does not leave it up to the water systems to do that because that's what happened in her particular community, and she was concerned about that. It also takes a class approach in that it doesn't list just PFOA and PFOS, but for anything that we have notification levels for. So where are we? This came from phase one. We actually have phase two data from the drinking water well investigation that's going on, but it's a little too soon for me to have put that into a slide. But what I want to show you about this is these are all the chemicals. There's 23 of them that have been tested for. We can now test for more, and that's going to be incorporated into the plan. But what's important isn't how many dots. It's, if you notice on the bigger part of this map, there are multiple colors in each of those circles. That's because what we anticipated was true, that we are not just finding PFOA or PFOS, we are finding multiple PFAS chemicals, and these are only the ones we can test for. It is a multi-headed hydra, as I said. These are some of the chemicals. Two more have since been added to this that I just couldn't get onto the slide. Interestingly enough, PFOA comes in third. A chemical called PFHXS, which is what was found in my water system, came in second. But also, some of them are short-chain chemicals, which is going to be a challenge in addressing. I'm going to skip this slide. And to say that we are getting toward regulation in the state, or at least we're thinking about it. We take our time on regulation because we do it based on science. And that is a good thing because we end up with a better result at the end of the day. We do have, just this last week, last week or the week before, revised our response level. So unlike a notification level, a response level is, okay, the chemical may not be regulated yet, but the water system has to take some action if they exceed this. So in other words, they could take the water offline, they could treat it. There are some communities that do not have those options yet, because treatment has to be put in, or they don't have another water source, and in those cases, they definitely have to give the public immediate notification. So these numbers were lowered from 10 to and 40 for PFOA and PFOS respectively. As an NGO, we always ask, could this have been lower? Because this is based on a 1 in 10,000 cancer risk, as opposed to, say, something for Prop 65 that would be based on a 1 in 100,000 cancer risk. That said, it's clearly moving in the right direction because the response level had been 70 for both chemicals. And so this is obviously giving more protection to the public. Our water board is also moving on setting new notification levels for 7 more PFAS that have been found in California. So more understanding by the public. And we are at the very beginning, and I won't go into details of this, of the regulation of PFOA and PFOS because of the wealth of data on those chemicals. Advocates would like to see, at least, if we can't take a broader approach, at least moving forward on at least one short chain chemical for which we do have health data. And part of the reason for that is because, you know, even if we just did 3 chemicals, that's not actually ultimately going to be health protective enough for the public. There's thousands of these chemicals. But it is an issue for water providers because what you do for PFOA and PFOS is a lot different than what you would do for a short chain, and we don't want to have to dip twice into that well and make separate investments. That just doesn't make sense. The other is, can we explore regulatory paths that are different than just a drinking water standard? Can we look at things like treatment techniques that would set levels for the class, or at least groups of the class, and then just kick in some sort of treatment that comes into play if you hit that number? These are questions. These are things that the water board is looking at, that state scientists are looking at, that NGOs are looking at, and there's a lot of discussion that continues to happen with all of us in that realm. Just 2 other parts of my presentation. What else is going on in California? Because it's not just water. So first of all, the Department of Toxic Substances Control has a program called Safer Consumer Products. That program is meant to drive innovation when there is a toxic chemical or chemicals in products that are commonly used. Are there ways to either take that chemical out if it's not needed, or can we innovate and find safer alternatives? And that's really the whole point of that program. They have listed PFAS as a class, so when they regulate products, they are including any form of PFAS that exists now or in future. So the first thing they have taken on is carpets and rugs. That is about to be finalized. As you heard, carpets and rugs are stain resistant. That's where PFAS were used. Some retailers have already committed to not selling carpets, at least. Rugs are a little bit more difficult because some of them come from overseas. But for instance, Home Depot is not going to sell them anymore. I think they phased them out at the end of last year, maybe part of this year. But the state is moving on that regulation. They are proposing the treatment products. You saw a slide with a picture of somebody spraying shoes, but people also use them on clothing and furniture. And they are studying food packaging and whether they can regulate PFAS in food packaging. We also have a California biomonitoring program. That program actually looks at what Californians are being exposed to and what are the trends in that exposure. They actually look at people's blood and other bodily media and try to measure what's going on in Californians. And there were 4 particular studies that covered PFAS. Whoops, I don't want to get that far. One was an Asian Pacific Islander Community Exposure Act that took place in San Jose and San Francisco, looking at a wide range of chemicals, including mercury, but PFAS was in there, found very high levels in that population, maybe from fishing practices, because PFAS are collecting in places like San Francisco Bay and in wildlife. The California Regional Exposure Study, this is going to go on for many years. They're looking at usually populations in disadvantaged communities around the state in different regions, and they've started in Southern California. And then the California Teachers Study and the Firefighter Study, the Fox Study, showed very high levels in these two groups of people due to, these career paths that we know where the firefighters are getting it. We're trying to figure out where the teachers are getting it. Finally, local ordinances are starting to take this on. San Francisco and Berkeley both passed ordinances that were waste reduction ordinances. San Francisco was on plastic straws. Berkeley was takeout food packaging. But embedded in those ordinances were restrictions on what could be in food packaging, particularly takeout and restaurant packaging. Basically, they had to meet compostability standards that went into effect in January 1st of this year, and that meant no PFAS. So, because they do not want to contaminate their compost and cause problems there. So, local action. Looking ahead in 2020, Clean Water Action and several of our partners are introducing two bills next Tuesday. I live in Silicon Valley. I think I'd be better at this. Next Tuesday, we're going to introduce our bill with the California professional firefighters to do a similar ban to Washington. The only exemption that we are introducing in that bill as of right now is any place that is federally required to still use PFAS for a fire. But that is changing, as you heard. So we also have a right to know provision in the bill on firefighting gear. So that's exciting. That's Tuesday, but on Monday, and this came out of discussions with State Water Board staff, we're introducing a bill that would require the State Board to validate and certify testing methods in water for total PFAS, or at least the best surrogate. So it may be total fluorine, but from there we can extrapolate how big the PFAS problem is. We may not know what the individual chemicals are, but we'll know how big the problem is. And that is something that we've worked with the Water Board on. Last slide is what's going on in other states this year. Food packaging, these are the states that are trying to take action. Washington has already done it. California has tried to do that in the legislature. We failed, frankly, so that is why DTSC is doing it. So we'll get there as well. The firefighting foam, Washington has already done it. They're coming back to try to improve it. But various states are introducing polluter accountability. This is a mixture of lawsuits and legislation, primarily against chemical producers, but also in a couple of cases, Department of Defense because of sites where it was used. And then chemical disclosure, this can be a very heavy lift, but and it usually includes chemicals other than PFAS, but these continue to move forward as well. So with that, I will thank you, and I will turn it over to my...
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Andrea, for really a fantastic overview at this point. I'll try to do my best to contribute a gloss. I don't know if there's another. We'll leave it on Andrea's. I don't have any slides, so you won't have to worry about suffering through a PowerPoint from me. I want to just thank everyone for the invitation to join. Hopefully at this point, kind of add and be additive to what you've heard so far. So my name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. I feel very fortunate to be chair of the board at certainly a time where there's plenty of challenges abound. I am one of 5 on the State Water Board, and we have 9 regional water quality control boards. I think it's important, I'll just set some context. The State Water Resources Control Board first came about 50 years ago in 1969. Then Governor Reagan signed into law what was known as the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Act. it married what was then, through what was the Dickey Act in the late 1940s, a pollution control board, a state pollution control board with regional boards. Prior to the 1940s, pollution control was on a very local basis. Counties and cities would all try to regulate those activities that were oftentimes dumping just raw sewage places. It was a mess. And so in the late 40s, we had, premised off of local control, an act that brought together then a state pollution control board, it's 9 regional pollution control boards, and then like I said, in the late 60s, what happened was that was married with a water rights office. And so at the start of the creation of the state board, the premise that you can't regulate quantity and quality differently, that you have to do so in one holistic sort of breath, was a pretty strong premise of the board and its work. And we predated the Clean Water Act. And so if you look at US EPA and its structure of regions and regional administrators, it is not unlike, it's different, not too different from the state board and its regional administrative sort of structures. I will say that we kind of came into our own, kind of, if you will, evolved further as a regulatory entity just about 5 years ago, when the Division of Drinking Water was brought over from what was the California Department of Public Health and placed into the State Water Board. And so I like to think that the board is pretty uniquely positioned to rise up to what is, as you've heard, a pretty frightening challenge. I can recall one of the first informationals that was provided on this issue after I had joined the board. I've only been on the board for about 3 years, as you heard, and it can seem a little overwhelming. The long-livedness of these chemicals, the persistence of them, and their bioaccumulation, their still usage and grandfathered usage as well, which I think kind of points to a couple of trends that I'll try to touch on. But I think one definitely is one of, I'll just say, quite frankly, a broken chemicals regulation industry where we're allowed to have these constituents put into great usage and put into the environment before their safety is really known. And so what it does is it sort of turns on its head what should probably be more of a precautionary principle when it comes to our health, particularly, again, with a constituent, in this case, that is so long-lived and is such a permanent decision. And so, it's a challenge that we have, certainly, when we talk about these systems that we have, these drinking water systems. So, the context of the State Board, how it kind of finds itself with its authorities, both on the landscape level for water quality. So you heard from Andrea how we have testing going on airport facilities, places where we know firefighting foams were used, or chrome platers. Will soon be expanding as well into wastewater treatment plants, because what we are finding is that there may be active contamination happening and coming in through, and perhaps because of the usage of PFAS chemicals on our clothing and what it means for our wastewater streams. So, I think the board is positioned, to try and take advantage of whatever it is that we can do to leverage that sort of unique regulatory space that we find ourselves with, regulating both drinking water, so the quality of water coming out of individuals' taps, to, again, the landscape level water quality, and trying to connect the two. We're doing so with the help of our sister agencies at Cal EPA, because it is about the Department of Toxic Substance Control and what they can do in trying to staunch the flow, if you will, of their the chemicals usages in cosmetics or other public goods. And so, I think I would try to add as well that you see a very strong state response, and obviously here at the state, and in California, we have the State Water Sources Control Board. We have an existing Division of Drinking Water. We have the regulatory mechanisms to institute our own maximum contaminant limits on the drinking water side, to respond perhaps where before this was actually a function of the federal government. The federal government set priorities largely on the national level on new contaminants, drive new MCLs, and set them because not all states, again, fortunate that we are, but not all states have the regulatory mechanisms to set and the expertise and the dollars and the fee base perhaps to set these. And you actually see some legislatures, as I understand it, just setting them by legislative mandate because there aren't. And so there are ways that I think we're certainly challenged. You've heard the kind of scope. I think that sometimes and I'll try to wrap up my comments because I do want to hear questions more than sort of pontificate. But I think that what you'll kind of find are that there are more questions at this point than there are answers. And I think that is difficult sometimes, certainly as a regulator in a regulatory space. You heard of sort of legislative responses. As people become more aware of the challenges of PFAS chemicals, as they become more concerned, more pressure grows to do something quickly. And I think it will take, when it comes to the State Water Board, about 4 years, I'll say, to set an MCL. It's a lengthy regulatory process. We do pre-MCL measures, these notification levels, the response levels, to help sort of shape and guide and build data sets more than anything to allow us. And so to set a proper MCL at some point. So I think what you can look forward to is a longer term process, certainly at the State Board. We're aware of the great challenges that this particular chemical will provide us, but just really appreciate everyone's time and attention today and look forward to the questions more than anything. So thank you.
So, I'm with Pall Water. We're a treatment company, just to let you know. We're going to cover two things really quickly. We're going to cover soil remediation. We don't do that, but the two things that we have to address are contamination in the soil and contamination in the water. There's three major ways to address soil remediation: capping, capping, excavation and disposal, and what's called stabilization or sorption. All of these do not, the first two, capping just covers it up, leaves it right where it is, and tries to keep it from leaching down into the groundwater. The second one, you actually take it out and dispose of it, either in a landfill or actually bring it up to incineration temperatures, and we can break that bond between the carbon and the fluorine if we go up to about 900 to 1200 degrees C and break that bond. And then the sorption and stabilization, this is just to mix some substance with it that binds with the PFAS, the PFAS, in order to keep it from mitigating through the soil and down into the water. Those two do not remove the PFAS. It's still right where it was, but just tries to keep it right there. And then these didn't come out the way they were supposed to. There's something changed here. So thermal destruction is the last one, and that is destruction with heat directly on the contaminated soil. This can be done on site. There are big machines they bring in, sort of like those repavers you see that grind up stuff and heat it back up, but in this case we have to heat it much higher than that. Very energy intensive, and it has risks of potential vapors and things like that. So where are they found in waters? There's site contamination. Past PFAS may have contaminated the surface of the groundwater, and it may require water remediation, and this could be either surface or groundwaters. The incoming water, industrial process water, municipal potable water, both surface and groundwaters can contain PFAS, and the contaminated incoming water can result in the contaminated wastewater, as we talked about previously, but also can actually concentrate that with some processes. So if you look at cooling towers, things like that evaporate the water off and leave the chemicals behind, 10 cycles of concentration will 10 times concentrate the PFAS that they are going to dispose of volumetrically. So when we look at what kind of water treatment we want to employ in there, there's a number of different things that we look at, what the treatment goals are, how low do we have to get, what are the current regulations, what are your customers demanding that you get down to. what chain length and what PFAS chemicals are there that we have to take out, what the flow rate of the system is, what cost you want to look at, how much space do you have available to put this in, and then the other contaminants in the water. Organics and inorganics both affect the treatment technologies. These co-contaminants really help us decide what kind of treatment technologies we want to use. So here are some of the ones that are listed by the Drinking Water Treatability Database, which is EPA database. It was updated in 2018. You'll see the first several: aeration, chlorine dioxide, conventional treatment, which means what most water treatment plants use, which is coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation. That is ineffective. All these are. Low pressure membranes like MF and UF all by themselves, ineffective. Ozone, UV are both ineffective, although there's a lot of work going on currently in these technologies to try to get a process that will actually break the bond in the water itself. Then the ones below it, absorptive medias, they can be up to 90% effective in ultra-pure water tests that have gone on, but we'll see in the next slide that they're not as effective in real-life situations. Then granular activated carbon and powdered activated carbon. This absorbs the PFAS that is in the water and binds it to the carbon, and we'll see how effective they are. Ion exchange is another same type of process that binds it with resins. And then membrane separation using nanofiltration or reverse osmosis. And that one was deemed by the EPA as quite effective. So the absorptive media, as we said, ultra-pure water, it was pretty good. It was really good at long chain and sulfonated PFAS, but it had low removal of the short chains. In surface water, however, the removal of all the different PFAS was reduced substantially. And these are right from, and it didn't, as I said, it didn't translate very well, but they're right from the bottom there of the EPA treatability database. So if you want to look these up, you can. GAC and PAC, powdered activated carbon, granular activated carbon, again, May of 2018. There were some studies where the primary focus was on the optimization of PFOS, and that worked pretty well. Other studies on full-scale ones treating conventional as opposed to trace. So these were big cleanups where you had 1,000 parts per trillion to try to take out, and they were pretty effective at that. But they found that if it was trace down in the 5 or 6, it had more difficulty. And again, highly variable, and the long chain ones easier to take out with carbon, and the short chain ones take much more contact time with the carbon to take them out. Ion exchange is sort of the same way, highly variable depending on the species of PFAS that you're trying to take out. Again, long chains are easier, short chains are harder. So membrane separation is the RO, NF, nanofiltration, reverse filtration. So that is taking just about everything out of water by pushing it through semi-permeable membranes. It's just the reverse of the osmotic process that goes on in your body and in all living cells. So the PFAS from water using membranes was found to be quite effective. And bench and full-scale studies, and there have been a number of them done with NF and RO, showed removals greater than 99%. So if you have an under-sink RO unit and you maintain it well, your drinking water is going to be pretty good. Carbon, not so good because it depends on how fast you are flowing that water through that carbon to maintain the effectiveness of it. So this was the action plan that is ongoing now with the EPA. The one I want to hit is the last one, the analytical methods to address short-chain compounds is something that they have completed. So the method 533 is the newest one, and that adds additional 11 PFAS. So now the EPA has validated methods for 29 chemicals. And again, this one didn't translate very well, so we've got it everywhere. So we looked at this again, and when you look at this and what we just went over, then we come up with a treatment matrix that looks like this. So the flow rate is on the left vertical axis. You'll see down to 0.1 million gallons per day, a fairly small flow when we're treating drinking water, all the way up to over 100. And then on the horizontal axis at the bottom, you'll see the water quality. As the water quality gets dirtier and dirtier, the technology changes because you have to take other things out. If it's really clean water, has no organics in it other than PFAS contamination, it's fairly soft, it's fairly easy to take the PFAS out of it. So the chain length is the other one, the red line that goes up through the middle, and that is easier on the left bottom because the long chains are there. And as the chain gets shorter, which is now in this slide covered by the green one because of the translation into this, then it becomes harder. So then we look at the various ones that we discussed. The GAC ion exchange is IX, so if it's easy and long chain and fairly small flows, we can do it quite easily. As the flows get higher, we may need a concentration step. And that concentration step can be the NF or the RO to bring that volume down so you don't need as much carbon and you can have longer contact times. Then as we get more challenging to the right, MF and UF are a pre-treatment to that. You can take organics out, you can take iron out, you can take other inorganics out before it goes to reverse osmosis, so that helps. It also helps take them out in front of carbon beds, so you can use that when the water is more challenging. And then if you get up into the right top one, that's worst case scenario, then you really need to use a real good pre-treatment, a concentration step, and then final disposal or absorption through IX or GAC, and then thermally destruct that. So the membrane separation, the low pressure one, as we said, removes organics, inorganics, and particulates, so you don't clog up your carbon bed or follow your RO. And the high pressure one, as we said, removes a lot of PFAS. It does create that waste stream. You still have to get rid of it. Most of the carbon people do what's called thermal reactivation, takes it up to about 1,250 degrees centigrade, breaks that bond so that you don't have any of the PFAS left in the environment. This was a case study we did in Alabama real quickly. This was a membrane looking at different compounds. These are the compounds that were found. Short chain BS. Those were the concentrates in the feed. All the permeate, the part that went through the membrane, was all non-detect, less than 2. But the interesting thing in this is that you can test and you can show how much was really in because it was a 10 times concentration. So your concentration is 10 times more concentrated than your feed, and you're running at 90% recovery, so the 13 goes to 130. And these were averages, so they're a little bit off. But the 25 goes to 200, and et cetera, down through there. So they're a little bit off, but you can really concentrate up PFAS with RO membranes so you can have more accurate tests. And then this was a capital evaluation and operating. The GAC was cheaper initially, and that's what pushes you down in that lower left-hand corner. It's less expensive to put it in. If you have long chain, then carbon is the answer for you. If you're complicated like this, which was river water, a lot of organics, a lot of particulates in it, it drives the economics to an MF in front of a high recovery RO in this case. And that was 30% less over 20 years to own and operate that system. So these are some other things that you can look at. This is being taped, so I assume it's going to be somewhere, but they evaluated not only carbon, but ion exchange and AOP, which is advanced oxidation processes, UV and an oxidizer. And then they looked at all the different contact times they needed to get the PFBS out, 40 minutes of contact time, which was about 4 times more than they needed for their PFAS that they were taking out before. So this is what some of the equipment can look like. There's trailers available from various manufacturers for both carbon, ion exchange, and membranes. This is a membrane system that's an integrated membrane system. It has MF and RO in the background of it. And that's it. I wanted to run through these quickly because we want to do questions for sure at this point, and I'll turn that over to you to do that.
How might we adopt more precautionary approaches into a problem such as this, given that it's probably applicable to other environmental challenges we have?
Might be you guys, I think.
Well,
I only try to solve the problem.
I'll go first,
Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
since I'm the activist. But actually, we all are. I want to get that clear, that a lot of people, and you're obviously one as well, in our agencies, in our regulatory, in our government, are often activists too in their own way, working within the system. But you hit I think, first of all, and Joaquin, I think you said this before, we do have a reverse system in this country. You know, a person that goes out and commits a crime is innocent until proven guilty, right? And that's a good thing. That is not a good thing for chemicals, okay, or toxic chemicals, because who ends up being the guinea pig? And so there is a lot of talk and a lot of effort of trying to turn that on its head and saying, no, before you bring something to market, you have to prove that it's relatively safe. Now, some things are meant to be toxic. A pesticide is supposed to kill a living organism, but then there should be restrictions on the use of those products. But we do have a broken chemical structure, and then you have to end up then going back to issues like water and air and other kinds of environmental problems and try to resolve them. So you're absolutely right. I think, though, that the other part of the problem is influence. We do, as you heard from Joaquin, we do set our own drinking water standards. We set them for everything. Even when the feds do it, we have to go through our own process in California. And we have set chemicals, drinking water standards for other chemicals other than PFAS. I've worked on several of them. And the last 2 were hexavalent chromium, you know, Erin Brockovich story, and 1,2,3-TCP, which is was a contaminant in a pesticide. And in both cases, there was industry lawsuits against the Water Board for just regulating these chemicals. And the problem with that is that ultimately these chemicals get regulated, but it delays progress while communities continue to drink them. And so that's where I think there needs to be change. We don't want to take the right to push back against agencies when they do something inappropriate, but on the same token, we shouldn't prostitute the justice system to get in the way of protecting the public. The last thing I'll say to this is, in the case of PFAS and in the case of TCP, people are going after the original polluters. And what's interesting is, it's not always the people that use the product. For instance, we don't want to go after our firefighters who were forced to use these products and it got into the environment. We want to go after the companies that made these products and lied about them. And so, you know, frankly, 3M, I told you, is in Sacramento this week doing its song and dance to our legislature, but they are having financial difficulties, and part of it is the anticipated liability that's coming down the road. So there is some movement in that, but it's a perennial fight.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, I'm certainly not going to bring about, or absent necessarily the actual sort of precautionary principle being more instituted, we at the Water Board are simply faced with what we have. And so I think, to Andrea's point, it is incredibly important to go after responsible parties. And it is at least a really key part, for myself at least, of the work that we need to sort of anticipate and do. And on 123 TCP, I know there has been movement to help, because we know the responsible parties there, to not leave it to individual communities, often disadvantaged communities that don't have the sort of the dollars, the ability to go after a large company in court, and instead have the weight of the state be there to represent those that don't easily or aren't easily able to represent themselves. But I think that applies to all ratepayers. The thought even now that I know water districts are making decisions and terminations off of the response level and notification level work that the board is doing, those are dollars that ratepayers will then pay for treatment, for replacement water. And again, to the extent that there are responsible parties out there, they should certainly be the ones and not the ratepayers who have to pay for the cost of cleanup.
I have two comments. Number one, the Alabama project is being paid for by the chemical company that polluted that water source. They paid for the original carbon bed, and they're paying for the upgrade for that, so that should cheer you up a little bit. The second point is not so cheery, and that is that a lot of those chemical companies are now buying up water treatment companies so they can make money off the tail end of that as well. So just let you know.
You mentioned TRI, which is the toxic release inventory system, and actually for beginning in 2020, corporations are going to be required to actually report to the EPA their PFAS, where it goes and all those things. So at least we'll have the information to know who, and I hate to say it, that map that you showed is just going to show that everybody's releasing it and it's going all sorts of places, but at least we'll have that information. My other question really connects all this to federal legislation, which I know we're concentrating on California. We have the Lautenberg Act, which actually reformed TSCA. And I'm just wondering, why isn't PFAS on that list of the chemicals that we're going to go back and look at and actually maybe solve and maybe ban or something along those lines? I mean, I know the Trump administration is slowing that down, but I don't even think PFAS is on the list. I'm just curious about why isn't the Lautenberg law being used?
I think the Lautenberg Act was a moderate attempt to improve that program, but I think that's the broken program that we're kind of talking about. And while it was a moderate attempt, it has been, any reform that was coming out of that has, frankly, politics aside, been eviscerated in the during this administration. That said, I think that part of the problem is, actually, we've been using the number 5,000. I was at a meeting at UC Berkeley recently where somebody from EPA used the number 7,800. So I think the question is, what do you put on the list? Do you put the entire class? I would argue yes, and then make decisions along the way of how to handle that. The industry would tell you, you haven't proven they're all dangerous. So do you start with 2 chemicals? Do you, when that's really, because what's in our environment now, in 5 years, those are still going to be there, but we're going to have other chemicals out there too, because these things are being invented and used and just switching out for each other. So I think part of the problem is kind of where do we start? What do we put through TSCA? How do we study it? How do we determine what those health endpoints are? And I think we have to get away from the fact that we're never going to be able to study every single one of those chemicals. We're going to have to, as some of our scientists are trying to look at, is how do we group them and extrapolate what chemicals within the class that are similar are going to do to our environment or our health. But I think that's part of the problem. I think everybody is just kind of, oh my God, PFAS, it's like deer in the headlights right now. But I also think there is no political will right now to do anything through TSCA that's meaningful. I want to let Barbara answer that too.
I would just add one little thing to that, and that is the timelines for the Lautenberg bill for the risk evaluations are so tight that EPA only chose to put chemicals on that first 10 and even on the next 20 where they already had a package pretty much ready to go. So that's one of like the most direct reasons, but I agree with your larger picture.
So my question is, well, first of all, thank you all for coming. And my question is, what do you see as the role of Pitzer as an institution or collegiate institutions on the whole, as well as the student body, to contribute to solutions in this realm?
I'll say one thing, which is innovation. I think there is a real energy around innovation in this community, and we do need green chemistry. We need other solutions. We can keep going through each problem, but we really need something to move to. And thinking more about circular economy, in how we buy things. When you go buy a Gore-Tex jacket, like at some point it's going to wear out, you're going to throw it out. What's going to happen to that long term? Like thinking about, are there materials we can build our homes out of that could be recycled into another home? Just that circular economy thinking.
Thank you for the question. I think that when it comes to our academic institution, Pitzer as well, they're central to our success. At the State Water Resources Control Board, we're about 2,000 staff, which can sound like quite a few. But when you look at the purview over water rights, water quality, and drinking water, it's relatively small given the mission that we have to keep our rivers, lakes, streams, bays, and estuaries clean, to ensure our drinking water is clean, and to appropriate our water in this very arid state. So our academic institutions, but the students coming out of them are core to us actually being successful. We're going to see turnover in our workforce of about retirement somewhere around 40-60% in the next 10 years. And that's a huge turnover in the institutional capacity that we have. So if you're looking for a job, come to the State Water Resources Control Board. There are no more interesting, challenging sort of things that you could, I think, biasly so, engage in than in water. So.
And I would say that we have all those PFAS out there, so one of the innovations that really needs to be done is to find a way in the water itself to break that carbon-fluorine bond through some safe way so that we don't have to treat it 3 times in order to get rid of it.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like so illumined by this information that I'm almost feeling overwhelmed where to even look for solutions. First of all, I'm very sad that we're talking about only California or this state or that state, and yet there's a whole globe that is drinking and getting sick, and the system of health is incapable of addressing it. The other thing is, in the very micro level, I'm thinking, okay, what can I do in order to be a small part of the solution? And I'm thinking, okay, California has shortage of water. We are introducing gray water into the whole system. How is that going to affect the vegetables that we grow in our urban gardens? Because there is a kitchen water is going to have some, dishwashing liquid and whatever it is in it. I don't know about that. What does that do? The other thing is, I remember I used to have reverse osmosis, and the plumber came to fix it, and I said, is this true that for every 1 gallon of water you're throwing 4 of them out? And he said yes. I said, oh, take this thing out because we're having drought in this state. So that's another question I have. Even though it's expensive, it's not, unfortunately, available to everybody. And my last comment or question is there any way that we can write on the items like this cigarette, this is hazardous to your health, so that this thing possesses something hazardous to your health, and have some kind of identification on them, so at least people are becoming awakened and aware, something like that?
I'll address that last one first, and that is that there are attempts, and again, I'm speaking to California, but you saw on the slide several other states are trying to act on this to increase public right to know about the products they buy. Because you asked about what you can do now, and part of it is look at what you buy. In case of water, everything goes down the drain. Everything you use on your body, everything you wash you wash your clothes, everything you use ends up in water somehow. And that's very hard when you don't know, whether it's PFAS or anything, you don't know what's in that. Now, we've made some progress. There are 2 areas in California where there is public right to know. One is industrial. It's fracking fluid. There is no confidential business information on fracking fluid in California. How that got through, I think they just didn't notice. But it happened. The other is we did pass a law in the state on cleaning products that California and New York both passed laws, and Washington has also got laws in the books on other products to require that you have the right to know about what's in your cleaning products that you're using, because that's an exposure route to a lot of things. That said, I will tell you from personal experience that it is very hard to get those laws passed through legislatures because there is an issue of confidential business information. And while that shouldn't trump public health and the public's right to know, there is also, the legislators are also trying to balance protecting businesses and industries in this country, including our state. And so that comes into play. In the case of cleaning products, though, we came to the table with the cleaning product industry, and we were able to work it out. When we tried to put a requirement that it should say this food packaging contains PFAS, we couldn't get that out of committee. So it's frustrating. We try. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. The other thing is about the global part. If you watch there's a movie called The Devil We Know. It's a documentary that came out before Dark Waters came out. And that's a very good film in that it shows that this is a global movement. We're working in this country, but there are people around the world that are very vocal about what happened with these chemicals. And certainly in the European Union, they are looking at these chemicals as well. So there is movement. It's not just going on in Washington or California or Alabama.
I would just say, hopefully you don't feel too overwhelmed after today's discussion. When it comes to PFAS chemicals, although there is concern and there is attention and work being addressed here, it is in a class of chemicals that are emerging contaminants of concern, meaning we're still developing a lot of the science, and it's indicating that there's concern, and we're responding. But when we talk about the vast amount of water that's served in the state of California, 99% of it meets all of the standards that we have here in the state, which are more stringent than federal standards. And I think sometimes it's important to make sure to put sort of what we have in that context so people don't sort of get too, fearful of their supplies, that we continue to remember that we have to reinvest in them, that we will continue to be challenged with not just this constituent, but other emerging constituents of concern as well, and that we just need to know more and understand more. And again, have the institutions and government sort of policies and regulations in place that in the long term start to really help address this issue. Stop getting us on this treadmill of having to always respond, and address the already complicated legacy of contamination we face in this state, which isn't just PFAS, but the known things like arsenic or perchlorate or other contaminants out there. But again, helpful to remember and emphasize that 99% of Californians are served clean, incredibly clean, reliable, safe drinking water. And that's a pretty huge marvel. And it took generational investments, particularly from the federal side. And we are all struggling now that federal investment sort of pulls back. We're all, as ratepayers, more dependent upon then our dollars to maintain the systems that we have. And again, let alone adjust to the challenges that are out there. So they're real challenges. But always important to remember we bring into context the discussions, especially around drinking water, which is so personal that people, I think, can be easily scared away from their supplies.
I'm going to excuse myself. I need to catch a tight plane, so I am going to excuse myself. But thank you so much for having me here today.
So I know you are all focused on water, but I was curious, is there any data on other ways that humans might ingest PFAS chemicals, and what proportion might be through breathing in the dust from your carpets or eating a lot of hamburgers that are wrapped in the treated paper?
I'll take a swing at that. It's a emerging field in terms of research. Maybe 5 years ago, people thought that food was the primary way that we were exposed, but I think that's starting to change. There's some research that shows, especially people that are using the aftermarket carpet treatments, that the levels in the air, in their indoor air after that, are actually fairly high, and they were able to show a correlation between levels in the blood of the people that lived in those homes and the higher levels in the air. So I think air is something, we still don't have good analytical tools to actually measure PFAS in air, so that sort of hamstrings that research, but I think that is an emerging area. And then there's a lot more sampling going on right now around fish and meat and dairy and et cetera. So I think, sort of stay tuned. But at this point, in most of the water regulations, we're leaving a healthy margin for exposures from other ways. We know water isn't the only way that we're exposed.
I had a question on treatment. So how quickly are you seeing the market take on these treatment technologies, and to what extent is, I know you were talking about, right now regulation is underway in California, so to what extent are public water systems adopting these technologies, and how will that be paid for? Kind of give us a sense of the cost, how will that be passed on? Because I was kind of hopeful to hear about the fact that some of these treatment technologies are quite effective. So to what extent could that also be enforced, and how will the public, how will that be paid for?
Sure. The largest number, I think, of contaminated water sources are probably in the groundwater aspect of it. The one in Alabama is an exception. Several in Michigan are as well, where they do have dump sites basically along rivers where they disposed of a lot of this, and it got in the actual surface water they're using. So individual wells are not huge volumetric things, and they're typically clean water. So that's pretty much being addressed by carbon, which is the cheapest way to address it, or by ion exchange. And again, depending on the PFAS that's present there. The firefighting foam, which is probably the most common one that we're going to see anywhere because it was most widely introduced directly into the environment over large areas, is fortunately one of the easiest ones to take out of drinking water, and it's almost all in groundwaters. So with the right technology, with specific resins, there's some absorbents that are being developed now that are specific for one particular one, like PFOA or PFOS, so that those are quite effective and they're less expensive. Again, once you put them on that media, you do have to get them out of the environment. They have to either be sequestered in a secure landfill and kept there forever, or they need to be broken. The bond needs to be broken, and there's a lot of work going on that method, but the resins are typically burned, and they're plastics, and the carbon is typically reactivated in a non-oxidizing atmosphere so it doesn't burn up, and that does effectively break those bonds. The costs, are going to be borne by the ratepayers in most cases because it's pretty well diluted around. The DOD does have, I think the last number was the estimate was somewhere around $4 billion that they're looking at for firefighting foam mitigation, and that's what they're pushing toward having to spend to address groundwater.
So just to clarify though, these are not treatment technologies currently being used in municipal water treatment plants?
Yes, carbon is, ion exchange is, and to some extent membranes are when the water gets dirty enough or large enough volumes to warrant that.
I would just add that, it's important to reiterate, I think what's really going to drive the cost is the size of the chains that we end up going after. And that right now, most states are for sure going after the long 8 chains, the PFAS and PFOA, but it is the smaller 6 and 4 chains that are still out there that can drive up that cost, and that's where you start getting outside of the realm of just the granular activated carbon. But I think the resins are there. But unfortunately, it is going to be the ratepayers. But it is, and it's why, absent going after a class, we have to start signaling, and depend upon our toxicologists and for us the expertise of our sister agency, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, to let us know if we should need to start going after those smaller chains.
We've had several, I think we've got 5 different water systems that have installed treatment in Washington. One, their own fire department was the source, so they couldn't charge anybody. It was one city department charging another city department. That system cost $1 million just to install, and then it costs money to maintain it. So it is expensive. They were able to get like a 20-year loan to kind of amortize those costs out, so there's not such a steep rate that has to be absorbed. But in the other cases, the military is actually paid for a large public water system to be installed, and they are maintaining that. Again, that's us again. I mean, it's the military, but that's all of us. That's all of our
Money
taxes.
doesn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, I just have another question about disposal. So you mentioned it has to be either kept forever in a landfill or burned, but how sure are we of for example, when we're burning it, that we're not releasing VOCs into the atmosphere, or going to have another ozone hole issue, such as the case with CFCs in the Montreal Protocol, as well as for example, if we go after a landfill option, I think almost half of Superfund sites are in flood zones,
Yep.
And they're also not designed to be flooded. So how can we mitigate the after effects of even if we have regulation, now we have to deal with disposal?
Yeah, and it's going to be a perennial problem. You have to trust and verify. There has to be systems in there to verify the science that's behind that. Calgon, one of the big carbon companies, does have a process that has been EPA verified to actually break the bond in their high temperature reactivation process. So there are ones out there, but again, it boils down to the operation. If somebody decides to turn it down to 800 degrees instead of 1200 degrees, and suddenly you're just releasing vapor into the air again instead of actually burning it. So there's all those considerations, but again, it's the science is out there to do it at very high temperatures right now, and there will be more science coming down. There are some chemical processes with UV under very, very high temperatures and high pressures that have been shown to be good to break that bond. But again, it's high energy, high cost, and the simplest and cheapest way right now is to put it in secure landfills.
I was just going to say, you're asking the right questions ultimately, and the tragedy, I think, in some of the initial responses was, the granulated activated carbon or the media wasn't oftentimes heated to the right temperature because there wasn't the right information as to at what point does it break down. And you had widespread contamination just get worse because you'd have these facilities that were accepting all this PFAS because everyone's saying, let's not, we shouldn't be using it, the compounds are coming to them, and then they weren't incinerated at a high enough temperature and just actually have a plume of then contamination downwind from the facility because it just aerosolized it. So it is a very complicated thing that we're going to be dealing with. So.
I just have one final thought, which is, I mean, we're all in the like mopping it up afterwards mode, which is not where you want to be. And, you know, regulation is one way to get a handle on it, but, you know, there's something to be said for just consumer pressure, calling companies that you know, products that you love and say, we want you to work toward getting PFAS out of your products. I mean, Walmart and a Target, a number of industries have responded to just citizen campaigns, customer campaigns, where they weren't told they had to remove phthalates from all their products. They just said, our customers don't want this, we're gonna take it out, even though we don't think it's a problem. So, you know, don't forget about that too.
One last question.
Just a follow-up question about that. Is there some place where we can go, maybe a website or something that lists the products that we should, just like buy this, not that kind of list? You know, maybe they're like, say you want to buy a tent and there's a company that makes a tent that's more responsible than other. I didn't know about this issue before, and I would like to be able to be a more informed consumer. So where would we go for that information currently?
I would try Green Policy Institute. I think they've got some of those lists on PFAS. They've been sort of in the lead on that piece. Safer States have some things.
Environmental Working Group as a nonprofit, I know they have some resources usually. Yeah.
Environmental Working Group has a cosmetics database called Skin Deep, and you can look up whether any of your personal care products have those compounds in it. But there isn't one central site. Maybe we should do one.
So that might be a project for our student innovators, an app. So I really want to thank the audience for showing up and to our panelists. And there is food outside, so thank you.